this. I love autumn so much. Every time it comes around, I can just like sense my power growing. Hi, my name is EK, welcome to my channel Explain, and in this video I want to talk to you about royal sisters. Many moons ago I asked Twitter if they had any history questions that they wanted answering, and I carefully noted down all the questions that were given, and that was over a month ago. Life got in the way, but better late than never. The question I am hoping to answer today is from Antony, who asked, what happened to the siblings of the monarchs at the time? Which ones got married off to continental cousins and gone to greater things, or lead to family complications later on? This is an excellent question because it allows us to consider both gender and class or status. These women were princesses, duchesses, queens. They sat at the top of the feudal pyramid, but their gender denied them the political authority afforded to their brothers. By authority, I specifically mean their recognised right to rule through formal and official channels, sitting on councils, leading military campaigns, overseeing legislation and dispensing justice. The scholar Lisa Ben St. John describes authority as the publicly recognised right to give direction and expect compliance. However, these formal, more obvious channels of authority are not the only way to access power. Power, in this sense, is the ability to get shit done. Ben St. John describes it as the capacity to make things happen. For example, as a woman, you might not be able to command a monastery to release some of its property to you, but you could have dinner with the abbot. You could gift money to the monastery, or you could persuade your brother or husband, father or son, to intervene on your behalf. It's all smoke and mirrors behind the corridors of power shit. Women could access that power. They could influence those for whom political authority was legitimate, including their brothers, fathers, husbands and sons. And when those men were monarchs or princes, the power that these women could hold by proxy was enormous. To that end, there are three threads on which I wish to pull today. Firstly, how royal sisters were married according to their family's strategy and long-term goals. Secondly, how sisters could rule on behalf of their brothers. And thirdly, how some royal sisters ended up changing the fate of dynasties and entire kingdoms. The strategic importance of women was not unknown to contemporaries, and women always factored into their family's goals. In essence, if a king or prince had sisters, their marital destiny could make or break his rule. If a king or prince was unable to rule, his sister might step up and protect her brother's interests. And if the primary line of succession failed, she might ensure some continuity of rule by offering an alternate line of succession. But first, we will discuss marriages. We will start in 15th century Scotland with a smorgasbord of examples from just one generation of the Stuart royal family, and that is James II of Scotland and his sisters, of which he had 6. All 6 of them married, mostly in Europe. First, his eldest sister, Margaret, had arguably the most prestigious marriage of all the children. She married the Crown Prince of France. However, she died without issue after 9 years of an apparently loveless marriage. The next daughter, Isabella, married Francis I, the Duke of Brittany, and they had 2 children. After Isabella comes Joan. She was the only sister to not marry abroad. She did spend time living abroad while marriages were discussed, but she eventually married James Douglas, the 1st Earl of Morton. Joan was deaf, and her tomb effigy in Dalkeith may be one of the oldest examples that we have of an image of a deaf person. Between Joan and the next sister Eleanor sits James II, and on top of Eleanor sits the most magnificent hat that I've ever seen in the history of portraiture. Eleanor became the Archduchess of Austria through her marriage to a man named Sigismund. Next, Mary married Wolfert VI of Borcelin in the Low Countries, which was a place that Scotland had really strong trading links with. And finally, Annabella married Louis, the Count of Savoy, and then remarried later a Scot called George Gordon, the 2nd Earl of Huntley. All of these women had varying successes, personally and politically, but their significance to Scotland's foreign policy was enormous. Their marriages expanded the presence of Stuart Scotland on the European stage. James's sisters were expected to be the bedrock of these alliances and to put in the work to maintain these relationships. In an era where travelling was dangerous, more expensive and far slower than anything we could conceive of today, having a permanent representative not just in the court of an ally or enemy, but in their bed and potentially as the mother of their heir was pivotal. This significance wasn't lost on women or their families, which disrupts slightly the kind of Henrician idea that daughters were overwhelming disappointments for royal families, as well as qualifying the assumption that women were just overlooked in the political sphere. They had a part to play, and no matter how informal it might have appeared, everybody knew how significant it could be. After all, if they didn't, there would be no need to orchestrate these marriages. Fiona Downey actually describes marriages as a professional career for medieval princesses, a career which usually necessitated leaving their home, never to return, and potentially never seeing any members of their immediate family again. That was only partly the case with this next example, who is one of my all-time favourite women in history, St Margaret, Queen of Scots. Margaret was born a princess of the House of Wessex, who were the pre-Norman rulers of England. She was actually born in Hungary. Her father, Edward the Exile, was in exile, but Edward and his family, Margaret, her mother Agatha, her sister Christina, and her brother Edgar, were invited to return to England as a potential heir of Edward the Confessor, who was Margaret's great uncle. Except Edward the Exile pretty much immediately died on arrival, and so Margaret, her mother Agatha, her sister Christina, and her brother Edgar were without a throne in a country that none of them knew. Edgar, Margaret's brother, had a decent claim to the throne, but he was still very young, and before he had the chance to grow up, William the Conqueror turned up and won England at the Battle of Hastings. Margaret and her family eventually fled north to Scotland and were taken in by the King of Scots, Malcolm III. According to Margaret's biographer, Malcolm saw Margaret and her noble family and subsequently asked and received her in marriage, with her brother Edgar Etheling surrendering her more by the will of his people than by his own, or rather by the decree of God. The implication here is that Edgar did not want the marriage to take place, and some also believe that Margaret may have been reluctant as she wished to pursue a religious life. In my personal view, I would find Margaret's reluctance less likely. She may well have desired a life in the church, but I would wager that she understood that her lot was to create an alliance for her family. So I didn't mention this in the script, and it is a little bit, it's quite involved, so I'm not going to be able to summarise the entire thing now, and I actually plan to do a video or several videos about it. The biography of Margaret that I mentioned, which said that Edgar was kind of reluctant and implied that Margaret was similarly reluctant, it was a biography specifically written to create a campaign for canonization, and part of that was making Margaret saintly without denying the fact that she was married, that she was a queen, you know, a position of hugely secular authority, and also that she had had intercourse. She was not virgin, as indicated by her many children that she had. So this biographer was very much kind of putting her in this saintly guise, and part of that was saying, oh, she wanted to go and be in the church, but she had to marry this guy and she had to become queen. It was kind of, she didn't want to. Does that mean that she 100% did want to? We don't know. But it's the source, the biography that I'm talking about is more, it's not just relating things as it happened. It has a specific purpose and it has a specific angle that it is characterising Margaret against. But I'm going to do at least one, or if not more, videos specifically on St Margaret, and I will talk about the biography then. So yeah. Edgar's uncertainty seems a little bit more likely. The family were in a very sticky situation, somewhat at the mercy of Malcolm's hospitality, but at the same time, having a sister who was married to a king who might be employed in anti-Norman campaigns, would be considered a good result for Edgar's ambitions. Unfortunately, these ambitions were not met. Edgar was never crowned, and he spent most of his life bickering with William the Conqueror and his heirs and making failed attempts to seize the throne. By contrast, Margaret had an incredibly successful career. She contributed enormously to Scotland's religious fabric. She founded Dunfermline Abbey, brought the Black Rood to Scotland, and was eventually canonised. Is now one of Scotland's patron saints, and the oldest building in all of Edinburgh is a chapel dedicated to her. Incidentally, the Black Rood, so the Rood, sometimes called like the True Cross, was meant to be the cross upon which Jesus was crucified. There were a lot of fragments of the True Cross going around. I imagine that if you glued them all together, you would have more than enough material for one cross. It seems that she definitely brought one to Scotland with her, whether she got it from England or potentially from Hungary. And her youngest son, David, when he was king, built an abbey to kind of house it. And as I said, it's called the Black Rood. And he called this abbey the Holy Rood, which is now Holyrood. And then the palace got built. It's a very lovely palace. I do prefer Edinburgh Castle. I feel like there's too much royalist propaganda at Holyrood because it's still like an active royal thing. Like, she ain't coming up there anymore, but she came up, you know, every now and again and walked past a crown. The crown jewels of Scotland, peak. England could never. What was I talking about again? Marital alliances were not the only thing women had to offer their royal brothers. Sometimes they actually ruled on their behalf as regents. A regent is essentially someone ruling on behalf of the actual monarch who is unable to rule for themselves, often because they are too young, but also sometimes if they're unwell or otherwise indisposed. In parts of Europe where women were actually barred from attaining the throne, such in France, a female regent was sometimes considered safer as she would be unlikely to benefit from the monarch's untimely demise. This also happens with queen mothers if they are widowed and their son is still very, very young. Sometimes she will be given usually kind of a guardianship of the young king, because the idea is that if the king dies, she doesn't have a position. You know, her position in that court is entirely dependent on being the mother of this child. So again, it's seen as kind of a safer bet than if it's somebody from the line of succession. Not always. Sometimes the line of succession is kind of preferred. I wrote my thesis about Margaret Tudor, who was Queen Regent of Scotland briefly-ish, kind of on and off. And the main kind of rival for the regency was John Stuart, the Duke of Albany, who was second in line to the throne after, well, third in line, because there was, you know what? I'm getting distracted. So first, Anne de Beaujeu, sometimes called Anne of France. She was the daughter of Louis the 11th of France, and when Louis died in 1483, Anne's younger brother Charles became Charles the 8th of France at the age of 13. In some places that would be considered almost old enough to kind of assume personal rule. In France, Charles was not considered able to rule independently until he was 21. So their father Louis arranged that Anne and her husband would rule on Charles's behalf. Her governance was not universally accepted. In 1484, her brother-in-law, the Duke of Orleans, staged a rebellion. Anne's mother, Charlotte of Savoy, actually sided with the Duke, but the Duke's wife, who was the sister of Anne and Charles, supported Anne. The rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful and Anne remained in a position of power until 1492. Right, coming up it's Mary's and Margaret's as far as the eye can see. Mary of Hungary was the daughter of Joanna of Castile and Philip of Burgundy. She married the King of Hungary, Louis II, in 1515, and when he died in 1526, her brother Ferdinand claimed rule of Hungary because he was married to Louis's sister. Ferdinand ordered Mary to stay and govern on his behalf, much to her dissatisfaction, and in 1528 she managed to persuade him to relieve her of command. Unfortunately for her, this aversion to power would go unrecognised. By this point, Ferdinand and Mary's brother, Charles, had actually succeeded his grandfather's position as the Holy Roman Emperor. Charles V oversaw an enormous melange of territories from the Netherlands to Burgundy, Austria, Castile and Aragon, and Spain's colonies in Central and South America. Understandably, trying to rule all of these kingdoms on your own was impossible. Charles had actually appointed his aunt, Margaret of Austria, as regent of the Netherlands, but after she died in 1530, Charles turned to his younger sister. Like Anne de Beaujeu, Mary faced rebellions, but unlike Anne, Mary's exercise of power was always reluctant. As with Hungary, Mary begged her brother for reprieve, but Charles refused, and she was not permitted to resign until 1555, where her brother Charles abdicated as Holy Roman Emperor in favour of his brother Ferdinand. Ferdinand did not receive the entirety of his brother's territories. Some of them were parcelled out, and Netherlands was given to Charles's son, Philip II of Spain. King Philip II of Spain! Of Spain! Sorry. Governorship over the Netherlands, however, was to remain in female hands. In 1559, Philip II of Spain appointed his half-sister, Margaret of Parma, as its regent. Margaret was the illegitimate but acknowledged daughter of Charles V. Like their father, Philip ruled a collection of geographically disparate territories, including the Netherlands, but also Spain, which became the focus of his rule. Margaret's premiership over the Netherlands saw brutal civil wars of religion, with various Protestant confederacies seeking to oust their Catholic Habsburg rulers. Sarah Gristwood states that Margaret managed to broker a truce, but her half-brother sent the Duke of Alba to brutally put down the insurgents. Subsequently, Margaret resigned the regency and was replaced by Alba. Her post-regency career included advising her half-brother John of Austria, who was another illegitimate child of Charles V. Neither Margaret of Parma, Mary of Hungary, or Anne de Beaujeu were ever made monarchs in themselves. Much of Western Europe spent centuries conniving to exclude women from the line of succession. Nevertheless, women, specifically sisters, have fundamentally and repeatedly changed the dynastic fortunes of entire kingdoms, and I want to talk about some examples specifically from England and Britain. We will begin with Adela, who was the daughter of William the Conqueror. Two of her brothers succeeded their late father as king, William Rufus, or William II, and Henry I. Henry I had one legitimate son with his wife, Matilda, who incidentally was the daughter of St Margaret of Scotland, but their son died in 1120 in a shipwreck in the English Channel. So Henry chose to name their legitimate daughter, also called Matilda, as his heir. In childhood, Matilda had actually been married to the Holy Roman Emperor, but he died in 1125, and subsequently in 1128 she married Geoffrey of Anjou. In 1135, when her father passed away, Matilda attempted to claim the throne.
Starts in 1135 when King Henry, my father, died.
However, Matilda's cousin Stephen, the son of Adela, claimed the throne for himself, and it spilled into a civil war known as the Anarchy.
Ugh, more strife.
Various characters got involved, including Matilda's husband, her many half-brothers, and her son, and even Stephen's wife, also called Matilda, got involved. Stephen ultimately won the war, but after his wife died in 1152 and his eldest son in 1153, he ultimately agreed to pass over his other son for Matilda's son Henry, who became Henry II in 1154. Henry's father was Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Duke of Anjou, and it is through this that we get the Plantagenet dynasty, who ruled England until 1485. So in this vignette we have two sisters. We have Adela as the sister of William II and Henry I, and then we have Matilda as the sister of her father's heir, who obviously died in that shipwreck. And while the Adela line won out in the short term, in the long term it reverted back to kind of that original line of descent. Now, we can't talk about kind of late medieval, early modern history in Britain without talking about the Tudors. The Tudors have plenty of female characters. I bet you can name 6, but I want to talk about Margaret and Mary, who were the sisters of Henry VIII. Margaret was Henry's older sister, and she married the King of Scots, James IV, in 1503. This marriage represented England's foreign policy. Their marriage was intended to embody the Treaty of Perpetual Peace signed between James IV of Scotland and Margaret's father, Henry VII of England. Henry VIII's younger sister Mary married the King of France in 1514, also to kind of represent peace between the two countries. But the King of France died shortly afterwards without issue, and so Mary secretly married Charles Brandon, who was actually Henry VIII's best friend. Mary and Charles had a daughter named Frances, and she went on to have 3 daughters called Jane, Catherine and Mary. When Henry VIII's son Edward died in 1553, Edward tried to have Jane named Queen by virtue of her descent from Mary. Frances, incidentally, was still alive at this point, but Jane was married to a man called Guildford Dudley, whose father, the Duke of Northumberland, was kind of eagerly playing queenmaker, and it stands to reason that the Duke would want his daughter-in-law on the throne over her mother. Jane's moniker, the 9 Days Queen, somewhat spoils the ending of this would-be coup. Edward's scheme failed, and his Catholic half-sister, Mary, instead seized the throne. Henry VIII's elder sister, however, had much more dynastic impact. Margaret was the great-grandmother twice over of James VI of Scotland, who ascended to England's throne in 1603 as James I. Margaret had had 2 children, James V and Margaret Douglas, by 2 different fathers. James V's daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, you might have heard of her, married Margaret Douglas's son. James VI thus claimed the throne of England through Margaret Tudor, as she was a daughter of Henry VII. James ruled quite successfully over this regnal union until 1624 when he passed away. In 1625, you fucking idiot. Like, how do you have 2 degrees in this? My god. And our next royal sister is his daughter Elizabeth. Princess Elizabeth Stuart was born in England and was married to Frederick, the King of Bohemia. In 1604, the Gunpowder Plot, which planned to kill James VI and possibly his eldest son Henry, sought to place Elizabeth on the throne, force her to convert to Catholicism and rule through her. This, of course, failed, and James's eldest son Henry died at the age of 18, so it was Elizabeth's younger brother Charles who succeeded to the throne in 1624. 1625. It's still 1625. It was 1625 earlier when I got it wrong. It remains 1625. Now, while James VI ended his rule in peace, Charles ended his in pieces. Pause for laughter. Charles's 2 sons, Charles and James, ruled as Charles II and James VII/2. They ruled consecutively from 1660 to 1689, after which the so-called Glorious Revolution deposed James II for having the audacity not only to be Catholic, but to have a son who was also Catholic. The coup placed James's eldest Protestant daughter Mary on the throne alongside her husband and cousin William of Orange. After the couple died without issue, Mary's sister Anne ruled, but despite numerous pregnancies, none of her children with George of Denmark survived past infancy. And so with Anne's death in 1714, the Stuart line came to an end. Or did it? Remember Elizabeth Stuart from literally 2 minutes ago? Well, she had 13 children, all but one of whom were Protestant, and it was this characteristic that was of chief interest to Britain when deciding who should rule after Anne's death. As I said, Anne died in 1714, months after the death of Elizabeth's last surviving child, Sophia, the Electress of Hanover. So that was Sophia out of the running. But she had a son, a Protestant son, named George, with a claim via his grandmother, Elizabeth Stuart, to the throne of Britain. And so in 1514 he accepted the invitation of the British Parliament, 1714, and became the first of 6 Hanoverian monarchs, 4 Georges, 1 William and 1 Victoria. So you can see this is a continued trend when either the line itself has come to an end or the next heir is considered unacceptable. Royal sisters provided an alternative. The preference, of course, was for a male heir, but women could transfer this inheritance to their children regardless of whether they were or were not considered a legitimate candidate. This potential was recognised by prospective husbands, and a woman with an interesting claim was a more attractive marriage prospect, even if she would have never been permitted or expected to fulfil that role herself. The central idea here is that even within the strictures of patriarchy, women could still pull the levers of power through their brothers. Royal sisters were pivotal to their families. Their marriages were arranged for political and diplomatic benefit. Sisters sometimes ruled, occasionally with reluctance, as their brothers' regents or lieutenants, and sometimes even years after their deaths, these sisters changed the fabric of Europe through providing a secondary dynasty when the primary line of succession had sputtered out. I would love to hear what you think of these sisters, or if there's some other significant sisters that I've missed, please feel free to drop it in the comments. Thank you to Antony for asking the question, thank you to you for watching, and until next time.